Time is a slow-moving river. It carries the weight of every choice made and every secret kept. Tonight, we find ourselves in the deep, humid embrace of northeast Louisiana, near the quiet town of Tallulah. The year is 1948, and the air is thick with the scent of damp earth and the lingering warmth of a fading October sun. Here, the landscape is a tapestry of dark water and ancient trees. Where the Mississippi River carves its path through the silt of the Delta, it is a place where the world feels older and the nights feel longer. Walter Dorman was a man who appreciated the stillness. At 42 years old, he had spent his life in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, working as a house painter. His hands were accustomed to the steady, rhythmic motion of the brush, and his mind was often occupied by the simple geometry of a job well done. He was a man of quiet habits, seeking nothing more than a brief respite from the turpentine and the ladders. He traveled toward the water, toward a fishing camp nestled in the shadows of Lake Providence. The camp was a humble collection of cabins owned by George Dowdy, a 68-year-old man who carried the authority of a plantation straw boss. George ran the camp with his son, J.D. Dowdy, a young man of 23 who had recently returned from the battlefields of the Second World War. To Walter, they were simply hosts in a landscape of peace. He did not know that the Delta, for all its beauty, was about to become the setting for a deception so profound it would echo through the decades. The river does not hurry. It carries the weight of the South with a slow, deliberate grace, much like the sleep that is beginning to find you now. The silence of the Delta is profound, but on this night, it was a silence waiting to be broken. On the evening of October 22nd, 1948, the moon cast a pale, silver light over the ripples of the lake. Walter Dorman and J.D. Dowdy were seen together near one of the cabins, two figures silhouetted against the encroaching dark. There was no outward sign of tension, no raised voices to disturb the nesting birds. But inside the cabin, the air was heavy with a hidden weight. 50 pounds of dynamite had been placed beneath the floorboards, a massive charge typically reserved for clearing heavy debris or for the illicit practice of stunning fish in the deep bends of the river. At 11:30, Walter Dorman stepped into the small room. He likely smelled the wood smoke from the nearby hearth and the faint metallic tang of the lake. The explosion was not merely a sound. It was a physical erasure. The cabin did not burn. It shattered into several thousand jagged fragments of timber and glass. A violent expansion of energy that was felt by every resident within a 5-mile radius. In the immediate aftermath, the only sound was the settling of ash and the distant, rhythmic croaking of frogs in the marsh. When the elder George Dowdy arrived at the site of the crater, he did not find a building. He found a void. The local authorities were summoned to the wreckage, where only a pair of legs remained of the occupant. George Dowdy, his voice heavy with a performative grief, looked upon the remains and identified them as those of his son, J.D. He spoke to the gathered neighbors and reporters with a somber detachment, claiming that the young veteran was like a brother to him. The town of Tallulah mourned the loss of a son who had survived the horrors of war, only to perish in a tragic accident in the woods of his own home. But the truth, much like the rising tide of the river, has a way of uncovering what has been buried in the mud. Greed is a quiet moth. It eats away at the fabric of a life until only the holes remain. 2 days after the blast, the stillness in Hattiesburg was broken by a wife's growing anxiety. Walter Dorman had not returned from his vacation, and the silence from the Delta was uncharacteristic of the man she knew. When the police began to trace Walter's final movements, the threads of the Dowdy deception began to unravel. They arrived at the fishing camp to find a family in mourning. But the timing was too precise to be ignored. If J.D. Dowdy was the one who had perished in the explosion, the investigators wondered, then where was the house painter from Mississippi? The inquiry shifted from a tragedy to a cold, clinical puzzle. They soon discovered that J.D. Dowdy was worth $36,000 in the eyes of an insurance company. In the economy of 1948, this was a staggering sum, equivalent to nearly $400,000 today. The policy contained a double indemnity clause, a provision that would double the payout in the event of an accidental, violent death. Witnesses began to emerge from the periphery of the town, their memories sharpened by the strangeness of the event. A taxi driver recalled the night of the 22nd, remembering 2 men he had dropped off within walking distance of the cabin. One was heavily intoxicated, leaning on the other for support. Their descriptions matched Dorman and J.D. Dowdy perfectly. Then came the ledger from a local supplier, recording the purchase of 50 pounds of dynamite by J.D., himself just days prior. George Dowdy was brought in for questioning, his composure as a plantation boss failing him under the steady gaze of the law. His accounts of the insurance and the dynamite were inconsistent, shifting like the silt of the riverbank. Finally, the wall of lies crumbled. The plan had been as simple as it was monstrous. Find a stranger, end his life, and claim the silver. There is no distance great enough to outrun the shadow of one's own choices. While his father sat in a cold cell in Tallulah, J.D. Dowdy was a ghost moving through the landscape. He had fled the scene of his own staged death, traveling west toward the border where Louisiana meets the red clay of Texas. This is a region of dense pine curtains and winding trails, a place where a man might expect to vanish. But J.D. lacked the cunning of a true fugitive. He was a man driven by a frantic, uncoordinated instinct. On the 1st of November, the law found him. He had just emerged from the home of his sister, perhaps seeking a final moment of familiar comfort before the world closed in. The capture was a quiet affair, lacking the drama of a struggle. It was merely a tired young man being led away in iron. As he was transported back to face trial, the magnitude of the crime began to settle over the parish. He had not just taken a life. He had attempted to steal the very identity of the deceased to secure a future he did not earn. At the trial, the courtroom was a theater of the mundane and the horrific. 50 witnesses were called to testify, building a wall of evidence out of insurance papers and dynamite crates. J.D.'s defense was a desperate attempt to paint him as goofy and weird, a man whose mental faculties were too dim to grasp the gravity of his actions. They hoped to save him from the finality of the chair by appealing to the jury's pity. But the jury saw a man who had sat in the dark and waited for a stranger to walk into a trap. The verdict was delivered with the weight of a closing door. Guilty. The sentence was death. Justice, in its final hour, is often a quiet, mechanical affair. The end for J.D. Dowdy arrived on January 12, 1951. In that era, Louisiana utilized a unique and grim apparatus, a portable electric chair that traveled from parish to parish. It brought the state's final judgment to the very soil where the crime had been committed. In Madison Parish, the chair was prepared in a room that felt too small for the gravity of the moment. J.D. spent his final hours in a state of strange, detached calm. When asked for his final thoughts, he maintained a stubborn anchor of innocence, claiming he held no grudges and could explain every piece of evidence against him. Across the street from the jail, a car was parked in the shadows. Inside sat J.D.'s mother and sister, unable to witness the event but unwilling to leave. They sat in the dark, watching the windows of the building, waiting for the silence to change. They had visited him the evening before, a final meeting between a mother and a son who was already a ghost in the eyes of the law. At the appointed hour, the state performed its duty. J.D. Dowdy was pronounced dead at the age of 26. His body was taken far from the humid Delta, back to his mother's hometown of Ringling, Oklahoma. There he was buried in a red earth, away from the fishing camps and the $36,000 that had promised a life he would never lead. Walter Dorman, the house painter who only wanted a few days of quiet by the water, was finally remembered not as a pair of remains in a crater, but as a man whose life had been unjustly cut short. The river returned to its slow crawl, and the Delta kept its peace. The mountains hold their secrets in the cold, thin air, far above the world of men. As we leave the humid swamps of Louisiana, we travel west, across the vast plains and into the jagged peaks of the San Bernardino Mountains of California. The year is 1946. Here, the air is crisp and carries the sharp scent of cedar and pine. It is a place of immense beauty, but in the winter of that year, it became a place of dark discovery. Arthur Eggers was a man who felt the world was moving faster than he was. He was a husband who lived with the constant biting sting of perceived betrayal. He believed himself to be a cuckold in his own home, watching as his younger, more vibrant wife lived a life that seemed to exclude him entirely. One night, Arthur arrived home to see a man leaving his house. Inside, the atmosphere was heavy with the aftermath of a secret. Arthur, fueled by a sudden, sharp rage, reached for his firearm. He later claimed he intended to chase the lover, but his wife stood in his way. In the struggle that followed, the weapon discharged. But what followed was no accident. It was a clinical, horrific attempt to erase a person from existence. He removed her head and her hands, the parts of a human being that carry the most identity and history. He drove deep into the mountains, dumping the torso in the cold shadows of the San Bernardino range. When the remains were eventually found, the mystery gripped the coast. Her head was never located, a missing piece of a puzzle that would haunt the investigators for years. Arthur's behavior during the trial was described as wacky, a man detached from the reality of his own hands. He was a man who had tried to cut his way out of a problem, only to find that the mountains always give up what is hidden in the snow. A party is a circle of light that eventually fades into the gray of morning. Now, let us turn our gaze north to Spokane, Washington. It is January 15th, 1944. The world is at war, and in a small shack at the back of the Dillon sign shop on Sprague Avenue, a different kind of violence had taken place. The scene was one of unimaginable brutality. 4 people attacked with a hatchet, two were dead, one would succumb to injuries days later, and one, Frank Winnett, would survive with wounds that erased his memory of the night entirely. At first, the police looked at Charles Staples, the husband of one of the victims. He was described as the coldest-blooded man the prosecutor had ever encountered, a man with blood on his shoes and a reputation as a communist. The town was ready to condemn him. But then, the focus shifted to Woodrow Wilson, Whitey Clark. Whitey had been at the party, a gathering born of a chance meeting at a tavern. It was the kind of wartime celebration where strangers become temporary friends over a bottle. The prosecution claimed that Whitey had stayed behind when the others left, and that, in a fit of rage, he had picked up a hatchet. They argued that he had attacked his companions while they slept in the quiet hours of the morning, but the evidence was a thin web of circumstances. Two newsboys saw a man in a white shirt with blood on it, asking for directions downtown. When the police found Whitey, there was only a small spot of blood on his pants, which his roommate claimed was from a nosebleed days earlier. Yet, the jury watched Whitey's every move. They saw his roving eye when a pretty woman entered the court. They judged him not just on the facts, but on his demeanor. They found him guilty, convinced by the little things that suggested a hidden darkness. Hope is a flickering candle in a very long hallway. Whitey Clark was sentenced to hang on October 5th, 1945. He was moved to the death cell, a place where the seconds are counted by the heavy thud of a heartbeat. A chaplain sat with him through the night, offering the only comfort available in such a place. But 7 hours before the trapdoor was to drop, the phone rang. It was the lieutenant governor. A deluge of petitions had arrived from Spokane, signed by citizens who were uneasy with a conviction based so heavily on circumstantial evidence. Whitey was granted a 90-day stay. For 3 months, he lived in the shadow of the gallows, a man whose life was a matter of public debate. A citizens' committee was formed to argue for life imprisonment, citing the many doubts that remained in the case. But the machinery of the law, once set in motion, is difficult to halt. On February 4th, 1946, the chaplain returned. Whitey ate his final meal in the quiet of his cell. At midnight, he was led to the gallows. His arms were strapped to his sides, and his legs were bound together. An expert adjusted the noose to ensure the end would be quick. In an adjacent room, 3 volunteers pressed 3 buttons simultaneously. Only one of those buttons sprung the trap. Whitey Clark was pronounced dead 15 minutes later. Whether he was a monster or a victim of a tragic series of coincidences is a question that stayed in the room long after his body was cut down. The truth remains as elusive as the morning mist over the Spokane River. A small town is a family, and when one member is lost, the silence is felt by all. Finally, we traveled to the heart of the country, Sutton, Nebraska, in the summer of 1943. Anna Milroy was 16 years old, the oldest of 8 children. She was a girl of the plains, a junior in high school who spent her weeks working on a farm and her weekends in the simple embrace of her hometown. On a Saturday evening in August, she met her sister and a friend for a movie. Before heading home, they stopped at Yost's service station. Anna went to use the restroom, telling her friends to go on ahead. She never came back. Her friends assumed she had walked home alone in the warm night air. Her family realized the truth the next day when her bed remained empty. The search for Anna brought the entire town together. The fire whistle blew. a mournful sound that called men from their fields and women from their kitchens. On Monday, a farmer found her remains while mowing weeds along a gravel road. She had been battered with a car crank and a chisel. The man responsible was Joseph McAvoy, a soldier from the nearby Harvard Army Airfield. He was a man with a history of violence, a predator who had forged passes to leave his base. He confessed to the crime, claiming he had a date with Anna, though her family knew the truth of her character. He had waited in the shadows of that service station, a man who had brought the violence of the world to a town that didn't know it needed locks. He was executed in 1945, after the state repaired an electric chair that had sat unused for 17 years. Anna's nephew would later reveal the most brutal truth. Joseph had attacked her one night and returned the next to finish what he had started because she was still alive. It was this second, sober act of cruelty that ensured his death sentence. The stories are told, the truth is found, and the night is yours to keep. We have traveled through the Delta, across the mountains, and over the plains. We have seen the darkness that men can carry, but we have also seen the light of the truth as it eventually finds its way to the surface. J.D. Dowdy, Arthur Eggers, Whitey Clark, and Joseph McAvoy. They are names etched into the ledgers of the past, their actions resolved by the passage of time and the weight of justice. But the people they took, Walter Dorman, Anna Milroy, they are the ones we remember. We remember their names, their simple lives, and the quiet justice that eventually restored their dignity in the eyes of history. As you lie there now, listen to the rain against the glass or the absolute stillness of your room. The world outside is vast and complex, but here, in this moment, you are safe. The shadows of the past have no power here. They are merely stories, echoes of a time long gone, told to help you find the path to a deep and restful sleep. The Delta is quiet now. The Mississippi continues its slow, ancient journey to the sea. The dunes of the coast are still. The fields of Nebraska are resting under the stars. Let your breath slow and become rhythmic. Let your mind drift away from the details of the trials and the evidence. Those puzzles are solved. Those chapters are closed for good. You have nothing left to do but rest. The weight of the day has lifted, leaving only the softness of the night. Stay safe. Be at peace. Good night. The river is a slow traveler. It carries many secrets. In the late hours of October 1948, the air was thick with damp earth. Inside the small fishing cabin, the light from a single kerosene lamp would have cast long, flickering shadows against the rough-hewn cedar walls as Walter Dorman prepared for a night of rest. He was a man who found comfort in the predictable rhythm of the water. The night was perfectly still. But beneath the floorboards of that humble shelter, 50 pounds of dynamite sat in the darkness, a heavy and silent weight that was intended to bring a violent end to the peace of the Delta. At 11:30, the explosion did not just break the silence. It shattered the very fabric of the evening, sending a shock wave through the moss-draped cypress trees that could be felt by every living thing for 5 miles in every direction. The cabin was rendered into thousands of jagged fragments, leaving behind a crater where a man's holiday had begun, and a stillness so profound it seemed as though the earth itself was holding its breath. The physical force of the blast was followed by a strange, drifting calm. As the dust and ash began to settle into the dark soil of the plantation, the only sounds were the distant calling of night birds and the soft rustle of leaves. Walter Dorman likely had the faint scent of turpentine still clinging to his hands from his work as a house painter in Hattiesburg. A mundane reminder of a life that was meant to continue long after this trip. The floorboards of the cabin, which had creaked under his steady footsteps just moments before, were now nothing more than splinters scattered across the damp grass. When George Dowdy arrived at the scene, the destruction was absolute. He stood at the edge of the crater, his face illuminated by the flickering lanterns of neighbors who had rushed toward the sound. Among the wreckage, the investigators found only a pair of legs, the sole remaining evidence of the person who had been inside. With a heavy, somber tone, George identified these remains as his son, J.D. He spoke to the local press with a voice full of mourning, describing the young veteran as someone who was more than a son, someone who had been like a brother to him. The town of Tallulah felt the weight of this tragedy, believing they were witnessing the grief of a father who had lost his boy to a cruel and sudden accident. They saw the wreckage and the sorrow, but they did not yet see the cold calculation that had been laid as carefully as the dynamite itself. The river continued its slow crawl toward the sea, carrying the truth beneath its surface, waiting for the light of day to reveal what had been hidden in the smoke and the shadow. According to the Monroe News-Star, the relatives of the young Dowdy were certain of the identification, asserting that these few remains were all that was left of their brother and son. The community gathered in a quiet circle of support, unaware that the man they mourned was at that very moment moving through the trees, a ghost in his own landscape. The silence of the Delta is profound, but on this night, it was a silence waiting to be broken by the inevitable return of the truth. As the sun began to rise over the shattered timber, the investigation began to look past the charred earth and into the financial records of the Dowdy family. It was there, in the fine print of an insurance policy, that the first cracks in the story began to appear. The weight of the $36,000 policy was a heavy motive, one that would soon pull the mask away from this staged tragedy. Not long after the funeral arrangements were discussed, the quietude of the Delta would be replaced by the steady, methodical questioning of the law. 2 days had passed. The house in Hattiesburg was quiet. Mrs. Dorman watched the clock on the mantel, its steady ticking the only sound in the living room. Her husband, Walter, was a man of predictable habits, and his failure to return from the fishing trip at the appointed hour cast a long, cold shadow over the breakfast table. She reached for the heavy black receiver of the telephone, her fingers tracing the cold plastic before she dialed the authorities. This call changed everything. While the Dowdy family in Louisiana was busy preparing for a funeral, a missing persons report was being filed across the state line, creating a second, conflicting narrative that the local sheriff could not ignore. The investigators arrived at the fishing camp near Tallulah with the scent of pine and river mud on their boots, only to find a scene of total devastation and a father who seemed more interested in the paperwork than the loss of his child. They sat in a small office where the air was thick with the smell of stale tobacco and old ledgers, and it was there that the existence of the staggering insurance policy was confirmed. The insurance documents were printed on heavy, cream-colored bond paper that crinkled softly in the sheriff's hands. Each clause was a step in a ladder that George and J.D. Dowdy had hoped would climb out of the poverty of the post-war Delta. To the investigators, the math simply did not add up. A young veteran with a modest background carrying a policy worth nearly $400,000 in today's currency was a beacon of suspicion. As they moved from the bank to the local livery and taxi stands, a clearer picture of the night of October 22nd began to emerge. A cab driver, his voice low and steady, recalled the two men he had transported through the dark corridors of the Pines. He remembered the weight of the man in the back seat, a man who smelled of turpentine and heavy drink, leaning into the shadow of the younger Dowdy. The taxi driver was specific about the journey, describing the way the headlights of his car had illuminated the narrow, gravel-lined roads that wound through the trees. He recalled the sound of the tires on the loose stone and the way the interior of the car had been filled with the sharp, clean scent of the October air. He had watched in his rearview mirror as the two men stepped out into the night near the cabin. One was steady, guiding the other toward the dark silhouette of the trees. The driver had turned his car around, the red glow of his taillights fading into the mist as he drove back toward the town, leaving the two men in the profound silence of the woods. This testimony placed Walter Dorman and J.D. Dowdy together in the final hours before the explosion, a fact that George Dowdy had neglected to mention. The investigation then led to the ledger at the local general store, a place that smelled of cedar shavings and dry goods. There, among the entries for seed and coffee, was a purchase that chilled the investigators. 50 pounds of dynamite had been sold to J.D. Dowdy just days before the cabin was reduced to splinters. The clerk remembered the transaction, the way the heavy crate had thudded against the wooden counter, and the sound of the graphite pencil scratching across the receipt. Greed is a quiet moth. It eats away at the fabric of a life until only the holes remain. As George Dowdy sat in the interrogation room, the straw boss who was used to the rhythmic, predictable life of the plantation found himself trapped by the very details he had hoped would set him free. The interrogation room was a small, Spartan space that smelled of floor wax and old coffee. George Dowdy sat under the steady hum of a ceiling fan, his hands resting on a table that had seen 1,000 such inquiries. His voice, once heavy with performed grief, became thin and wavering as the inconsistencies in his story were laid bare under the steady glow of a single electric bulb. He spoke of the dynamite in vague terms, claiming it was for clearing stumps on the plantation. But he could not explain why his son had purchased such a large quantity so close to his supposed death. He could not explain why he had identified the remains as his son's when the missing house painter from Hattiesburg was unaccounted for. The weight of the evidence was beginning to press down on him, much like the humid air of the Delta before a storm. The wall of lies, built to protect a fortune, was being dismantled piece by piece. George Dowdy eventually leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking under his weight. The silence in the room was absolute, save for the distant sound of a train whistle echoing across the parish. The truth was no longer a hidden thing in the mud of the river. It was there, on the table, in the form of insurance papers and dynamite receipts. The plan had been to use a stranger's life as a currency, to trade Walter Dorman's breath for a stack of silver. George Doughty finally admitted to the scheme, detailing how they had planned to collect the $36,000 and leave their old lives behind. But the one thing they had not counted on was the quiet, persistent memory of a wife waiting in Hattiesburg, and the way the truth always finds its way back to the light. With the father in custody, the search for the son, who was now a ghost in his own story, began in earnest. J.D. Doughty was now a man moving through the fringes of a world that believed him to be a memory. He traveled west, toward the border where the lush greenery of Louisiana begins to give way to the rugged, red clay hills of East Texas. This is a landscape defined by its density, where the pine curtains are so thick they seem to swallow the very light of the afternoon sun. For a man trying to outrun a memory, these woods offered a temporary, cooling shroud. He moved with a quiet desperation, perhaps finding shelter in the hollows of the earth or beneath the vast, uncaring canopy of the forest. The air in the borderlands carries the scent of damp earth and resin, a fragrance that is both ancient and indifferent to the struggles of men. As he walked, the red clay of the region likely clung to his boots, a physical reminder of the soil that had already claimed the man he had murdered. The All Points Bulletin had transformed J.D. from a tragic casualty into a hunted man. While his father sat in the stillness of a cell in Tallulah, J.D. was navigating a landscape that offered no true sanctuary. On the 1st of November, the pursuit reached its quiet conclusion. He had traveled as far as the home of his sister, seeking perhaps a moment of familial comfort or a final meal that did not taste of wood smoke and fear. The capture itself lacked the frantic energy of a chase. There was no exchange of gunfire, no desperate leap into the brush. Instead, there was only the heavy, settling realization that the journey had ended. When the authorities arrived, they found a young man who seemed more tired than defiant, a figure of profound isolation returning to the very parish where the earth was still disturbed from the blast he had orchestrated. The transition from the wild silence of the pine woods to the structured quiet of the Madison Parish courtroom was a sharp one. The trial was a theater of the mundane, where the horrific details of the night of October 22nd were disassembled into a series of exhibits and testimonies. The prosecution was methodical, calling 50 witnesses to the stand over the course of the proceedings. Imagine the rhythm of those days, the creak of the wooden benches, the low hum of a ceiling fan, and the steady, rhythmic voice of the prosecutor. Each witness added a small, weighted stone to the scale of justice. There were the neighbors who described the physical force of the explosion, a blast so powerful it rattled windows 5 miles away. There was the clerk who recalled the purchase of the 50 pounds of dynamite, noting the weight of the crates as they were loaded. And there was the taxi driver, whose testimony provided a chilling glimpse into the final hours of Walter Dorman. He spoke of the 2 men in the back of his cab, one of whom was leaning heavily on the other, unaware that his holiday was about to end in a crater in the woods. In response to this mountain of evidence, the defense attempted a strategy born of desperation. JD's court-appointed attorney brought forward friends and acquaintances who described the young veteran in terms that suggested a clouded mind. They used words like goofy, weird, and unusual, painting a portrait of a man who was mentally deficient. They hoped to convince the jury that J.D. Succum was a person who moved through the world without a full grasp of the gravity of his actions. A man who had perhaps been led astray by a stronger will or a simple lack of understanding. They were trying to trade a life for a life, hoping to spare him from the ultimate penalty by highlighting his perceived limitations. They spoke of his time in the service and the ways he had changed, trying to find a thread of sympathy in a room filled with the memory of the dead. But the 12 men in the jury box looked at J.D. and saw something far more deliberate. They saw a man who had carefully calculated the value of a house painter's life. They saw the patience required to sit in the dark and wait for a man to enter a cabin rigged with explosives. They saw a man who had helped his father lie to the community, pretending to be a grieving brother to a man who was actually his victim. The courtroom, with its smell of old paper and floor wax, became the place where the truth was finally anchored. There is no distance great enough to outrun the shadow of one's own choices, and for J.D. Dowdy, that shadow had finally caught up. The verdict returned by the jury was a single heavy word: guilty. With that word, the fate of the 23-year-old was sealed. He was sentenced to die, not for the life he had supposedly lost in the explosion, but for the life he had so callously used as a pawn in a game of greed. To understand the gravity of that final word in the courtroom, we must return to the very moment the silence of the Delta was torn apart. The night was still. The river was dark. A soft wind moved through the cypress trees. In the small fishing cabin near Tallulah, the air held the scent of old wood and the faint metallic tang of the river water. Walter Dorman stepped onto the porch. The wood creaked softly. He had spent the day under the wide Louisiana sky, and now the promise of a heavy sleep was the only thing occupying his tired mind. He could not see the 50 pounds of dynamite tucked away in the shadows, a silent weight that had been placed there with a cold and meticulous intent. As the clock neared 11:30, the peace of the Delta was about to be replaced by a force that would leave nothing but questions in its wake. The atmosphere of the fishing camp on October 22nd was one of deceptive tranquility. Earlier that evening, the flickering light of a kerosene lamp had cast long, dancing shadows against the timber walls of the cabin. Walter Dorman, the house painter who had come seeking the simple rhythm of the water, likely sat for a moment in the quiet, perhaps listening to the rhythmic chirping of crickets or the distant, low hum of the Mississippi. He was a man accustomed to the steady work of his hands, a man who understood the patience required to let paint dry and the stillness required to wait for a fish to bite. Outside, the mist was beginning to settle over the tall pecans and the dark earth of the plantation. J.D. Dowdy had been seen with Walter earlier that evening. To anyone passing by, they were merely two companions of the river, sharing the cool air of a Louisiana autumn. But as Walter entered the cabin at 11:30 p.m., the trap was already set. The explosion was not a mere sound. It was a physical displacement of the world. The force of 50 pounds of dynamite moving through the confined space of a wooden shack is a thing of clinical, absolute destruction. The cabin did not simply catch fire or collapse. It was rendered into several thousand jagged splinters, a cloud of timber and glass that was thrown into the dark woods. The blast was felt 5 miles away, a low, thudding vibration that rattled windows and woke the sleeping residents of the parish. In the immediate aftermath, a profound and heavy silence returned to the woods. The only movement was the slow settling of gray ash and the drift of smoke through the cypress knees. When George Doughty and the neighbors arrived, they did not find a building. They found a crater. The destruction was so complete that the local authorities were met with a scene that defied easy identification. Among the wreckage, the only substantial remains recovered were a pair of legs. It was a grim and somber sight under the beams of flashlights. George Doughty, the elder straw boss, stood in the dark and looked down at what remained. With a voice that seemed to carry the weight of a father's broken heart, he identified the remains as his son, J.D. He spoke to those gathered, and later to the reporters of the Monroe News-Star, with a calculated melancholy. He described his son as being like a brother to him, a young man who had survived the horrors of the Second World War only to be taken by a tragic accident in the safety of his own home. The town of Tallulah felt the sting of this loss. They mourned for the veteran, and they pitied the grieving father who had been forced to identify his child by such meager fragments. But as the smoke cleared and the sun rose over Lake Providence, the clinical reality of the blast began to whisper a different story. The silence of the Delta is profound, but on this night, it was a silence waiting to be broken by the emergence of a truth that no amount of dynamite could ever truly bury. The investigation would soon find that the legs found in the crater did not belong to a young veteran, but to the painter from Hattiesburg who had only wanted to spend a few days by the water. The physical evidence of the explosion was a testament to a plan that was as cold as the river in winter. The dynamite had been purchased specifically for this end, a tool of the trade turned into a tool of erasure. As the local papers began to print the details of the tragedy, the first threads of the Doughty's deception were already beginning to fray. The peace of the fishing camp was gone, replaced by a meticulous search for the man who was supposed to be dead, and the realization that the grieving father was a man who had placed a price on a stranger's life. The house in Hattiesburg felt larger than it had just days before. Mrs. Dorman sat by the window. She watched the street lamps flicker to life as the evening shadows stretched across the porch. The smell of her husband's painting clothes, a faint scent of linseed oil and turpentine, still lingered in the hallway like a ghost that refused to leave. It was a familiar, comforting aroma that usually signaled the end of a productive day. But now, it was a reminder of a silence that had become heavy and absolute. When the clock on the mantel struck the hour and the front door remained closed, the quiet anxiety of a waiting spouse shifted into a cold, certain dread. She reached for the telephone, her fingers tracing the smooth, black plastic of the receiver. This single act, born of a wife's concern, set into motion a series of events that would peel back the layers of a Delta mystery. According to the records of the Hattiesburg police, the search for Walter Dorman began with a simple inquiry into his intended destination. They traced his path through the winding back roads of Mississippi and across the river into the humid embrace of Tallulah. When investigators arrived at the Doughty fishing camp, they were met with the sight of a landscape still scarred by the recent blast. George Doughty greeted them with the practiced somberness of a man in mourning. He spoke of the tragedy of his son, J.D., whose life had been cut short in a freak accident. He pointed to the crater and the debris, describing the loss of his boy with a voice that seemed to carry the weight of the world. But the investigators were men trained to look past the surface of grief. They noticed that while the town was mourning a son, there was no sign of the house painter who had come here for the peace of the water. The investigation soon moved from the muddy banks of the river to the sterile wood-paneled offices of an insurance agency. Here, the air smelled of old paper and the iron-scented ink of fountain pens. They discovered a document that changed the nature of the case entirely. J.D. Dowdy, a young man with few assets, was the subject of a $36,000 life insurance policy in the autumn of 1948. This was a fortune that could buy a man a new life or 1,000 acres of Delta soil. The policy contained a double indemnity clause, a specific legal promise that the payout would double if the death was violent and accidental. Greed is a quiet moth. It eats away at the fabric of a life until only the holes remain. The investigators looked at the signature on the bond paper, noting the steady hand that had signed for such a staggering sum. As the paper trail grew, so did the list of witnesses who remembered the small details of that October night. A local cab driver came forward, his memory jogged by the talk circulating through the town's cafes. He remembered the smell of cheap whiskey in the back of his taxi and the way the car leaned under the weight of 2 passengers. He had dropped them off near the rural cabin, watching as the tail lights of his car faded into the dark. One man had been stumbling, his movements slowed by drink, while the other guided him with a firm, purposeful grip. Not long after, a clerk at a local hardware store provided the final piece of the puzzle. He pulled a heavy ledger from beneath the counter and pointed to an entry made just days before the explosion. J.D. Dowdy had purchased a 50-pound case of dynamite. The wooden crate, heavy and smelling of sawdust and chemicals. George Dowdy was brought into a small room at the parish jail. The light from a single bulb reflected off the polished surface of the table. The straw boss, a man used to the quiet authority of the plantation, found that his words were no longer enough to hold back the truth. He was asked about the dynamite, the missing painter, and the son who was supposed to be dead. His explanations were inconsistent, shifting like the silt at the bottom of the Mississippi. He spoke of accidents and coincidences, but his voice lacked the resonance of a man telling the truth. Under the steady, patient gaze of the law, the elder Dowdy finally reached the end of his deceptions. He confessed to a plan that was as cold as the river in winter. They had chosen a stranger, a man with no local ties, to serve as a body for a ghost. The painter from Hattiesburg had been nothing more than a means to an end, a life sacrificed for a payout that would never come. The investigation had found its answer, and the search for the living J.D. Dowdy was about to begin. J.D. Dowdy moved away from the ruins of the fishing camp with the heavy, rhythmic gait of a man who had seen the far corners of the world and found no comfort in them. He traveled west. He left the alluvial plains of the Delta. He sought the rising ground of the Louisiana-Texas border. In this region, the damp, dark earth of the river bottoms gives way to the iron-rich red clay and the endless, whispering curtains of the piney woods. The air here is different. It carries a sharp, medicinal scent of resin and the dry rustle of needles underfoot. For a man who was officially a collection of remains in a Tallulah morgue, the world had become a series of shadows and narrow escapes. He moved through the brush like a phantom. He avoided the main roads where the headlights of passing cars might illuminate the face of a dead man. The psychological weight of such a flight is a burden few can carry for long. J.D. was 23 years old, a veteran of the Second World War who had returned to a home that felt smaller than the one he had left. Those who knew him often spoke of a certain slowness in his manner, a wandering quality to his thoughts that made him seem detached from the sharper edges of reality. As he crested the hills toward the Texas line, he likely felt the isolation of his choice pressing in. To be alive while the world mourns you is a peculiar form of exile. He was a ghost in a living body, seeking a sanctuary that no longer existed. According to the police reports of the time, an all-points bulletin had already begun to circulate, moving through the telegraph wires and over the radio waves, like a net stretching across the South. On the morning of November 1st, the journey reached its quiet conclusion. J.D. had sought out the home of his sister, perhaps driven by a primal need for the familiar after days of sleeping in the cold damp of the forest. The house sat in a clearing where the pine trees seemed to pull back, offering a brief respite from the claustrophobia of the woods. He had only just stepped away from the threshold of that family home when the law arrived. There was no desperate struggle. There was no final stand in the red dirt. There was only the metallic click of handcuffs and the heavy silence of a man who had run out of places to go. The officers who took him into custody found a young man who looked less like a mastermind and more like a wanderer who had lost his way. The return to Madison Parish was a journey back into the light of public scrutiny. The trial that followed was not a grand spectacle of drama, but a steady, clinical assembly of facts. The courtroom in Tallulah was filled with the smell of old wood and the low hum of a town seeking an explanation for a tragedy that felt too large for its borders. The prosecution was methodical, calling 50 witnesses to the stand. They presented the ledger from the hardware store, the insurance papers with their promises of thousands of dollars, and the testimony of the cab driver who had seen the two men on that fateful night. Each witness was a brick in a wall that J.D. could not climb. The evidence of the 50 pounds of dynamite was a physical weight that anchored the crime to the man sitting at the defense table. His court-appointed attorney attempted to paint a different picture, one of a young man whose mind did not function like those of his peers. 5 friends were called to testify, using words like goofy and unusual to describe J.D.'s temperament. They spoke of a man who was easily led, perhaps a way to suggest that the older George Dowdy had been the true architect of the plan. They hoped to find a sliver of mercy in the jury's hearts, a reason to spare a veteran from the finality of the state's justice. But the jury looked at the calculated nature of the act, the selection of a stranger, the coldness of the explosion, and the flight to the border. There is no distance great enough to outrun the shadow of one's own choices. After a brief deliberation, the verdict was read into the quiet air of the courtroom. Guilty. The judge's voice was steady as he delivered the sentence of death, a final period at the end of a long and dark sentence. Not long after, the preparations for the final act of this tragedy would begin. The date was set. Time moved slowly. In the early morning hours of January 12th, the air in Tallulah felt heavy. Louisiana maintained a singular and somber tradition during this era, utilizing a portable electric chair that traveled by truck from the state penitentiary at Angola to the specific parish where a crime had been committed. This apparatus, a dark construction of oak and wire, arrived to fulfill the final mandate of the court. The town remained silent. Inside those walls, the chair was assembled with a rhythmic, mechanical clinking that echoed softly against the stone, while J.D. Dowdy sat in a nearby cell. He appeared to be a man at peace with a reality only he understood, watching the light change as the sun began its slow ascent over the horizon. When reporters were allowed a brief audience, he spoke with a calm that surprised many, stating that he held no grudges and believed he could explain away every accusation. He maintained this posture of quiet innocence, even as the final technical preparations were finalized. The room chosen for the event was small, smelling faintly of floor wax and the metallic tang of old radiator heat. J.D. Dowdy, who was only 26 years old, was a far cry from the young veteran who had first returned to the Delta after the war. He sat with his hands folded, listening to the muffled sounds of the town waking up outside. There was no anger in his voice, only a strange, detached resignation that seemed to settle over him like the morning mist. Outside the jail, the world continued in its mundane patterns. A car was parked across the street, its engine likely ticking as it cooled in the damp air. Inside sat J.D.'s mother and his sister. They had visited him the evening before, sharing a final conversation that was shielded from the public eye by the heavy iron bars and the shadows of the corridor. Now, they were relegated to the role of silent observers from a distance. They sat in the dim light of the dashboard, watching the windows of the building where their son and brother waited. The heater in the car hummed softly, and the windows began to fog from their breath. They were not permitted to enter the execution chamber, so they remained in the safety of their vehicle, a small island of familial grief in a sea of legal procedure. Inside the room, the process was conducted with a clinical detachment. The state officials moved with practiced efficiency, ensuring that every strap was secure and every connection was tested. Justice, in its final hour, is often a quiet, mechanical affair. At the appointed time, the current was applied, and the life of J.D. Dowdy came to a close. There was no outcry and no dramatic final confession. There was only the settling of the machinery and the soft footsteps of the witnesses as they departed. The lights in the jail may have flickered for a brief moment, a small sign to those watching from the car that the end had arrived. Once the formalities were concluded, the body was released to the family. They did not stay in the Delta. They began a long journey northwest, traveling away from the humid swamps and toward the open plains of Oklahoma. The landscape shifted from the deep greens and grays of Louisiana to the rolling hills and red earth of Ringling. It was here, in his mother's hometown, that J.D. was laid to rest. The soil there is different, a vibrant, rust-colored clay that holds the heat of the sun long after evening falls. He was buried far from the fishing camp, far from the crates of dynamite, and far from the $36,000 policy that had served as the catalyst for so much destruction. In the wake of the execution, a different kind of silence settled over Madison Parish. The story of the house painter and the straw boss's son became a part of the local lore, a cautionary tale whispered in the shade of the pecan trees. Walter Dorman's name was cleared of the anonymity of the blast. He was was no longer just a set of remains in a crater. He was restored to his identity as a man who had simply sought a few days of quiet by the water. The insurance papers were filed away, their ink fading as the years turned into decades. The Mississippi River continued its slow, unhurried crawl toward the Gulf, carrying with it the memory of that October night. The truth had been unearthed, the debt had been paid, and the Delta returned to its natural state of rest. The weight of the past had been lifted, leaving only the soft, rhythmic sounds of the night to guard the peace of the living. Beyond the reach of the Mississippi, the land begins to rise, shedding the heavy humidity of the south for the thin, electric air of the high Sierras and the San Bernardino range. The year was 1946, while the rest of the country was settling into the post-war boom. A different kind of tension was tightening in the suburban shadows of Los Angeles. Here, the mountains loom over the city like silent sentinels, their peaks often shrouded in a cold, indifferent mist that smells of ancient sap and the crisp, biting promise of early winter snow. Arthur Eggers was a man who seemed to belong to an earlier, more rigid era. He was 52 years old. His life was measured in the steady, rhythmic ticking of clocks and the predictable patterns of his work. Yet he felt a growing, quiet desperation as he watched his younger wife, Dorothy, move through a world he no longer understood. Dorothy was vibrant and restless, a woman who sought the bright lights and the rhythmic pulse of the city's nightlife, leaving Arthur to sit in the deepening silence of their home, surrounded by the scent of his own tobacco and the weight of his suspicions. On the night of December 29th, the air in their residence was thick with the unsaid, a heavy atmosphere that seemed to press against the walls as Arthur returned home earlier than expected. The street lights outside cast long amber shadows across the pavement, and the neighborhood was settling into the quietude of a winter evening. As Arthur approached his house, he saw the silhouette of a man stepping quickly away from the porch, disappearing into the darkness of the street. Inside, the house was warm, the furnace humming a low mechanical tune that usually provided comfort. But on this night, it felt like a countdown. Arthur found Dorothy in the bedroom, the air still carrying the faint, lingering scent of a stranger's cologne and the warmth of a recent presence. The betrayal was no longer a shadow in his mind. There was a physical weight in the room. In a moment of sharp, crystalline clarity, Arthur reached for his handgun, his intention focused on the man who had just fled into the night. But Dorothy stood in his way, her voice rising in a frantic attempt to stop him. And in the confined space of the hallway, a struggle ensued. Arthur would later claim the weapon discharged by accident during the scuffle, a single, definitive sound that shattered the domestic silence and left the house echoing with a sudden, profound stillness. What followed was not the panic of an accidental tragedy, but a clinical, methodical attempt to dismantle a life that had become a burden. Arthur moved with a strange, detached precision, perhaps influenced by his years of observing the world through a lens of order and consequence. He understood that identity is tied to the face and the hands, the parts of us that reach out to the world and are recognized in return. In the quiet of his workshop, surrounded by the familiar smell of oil and metal, he removed her head and her hands. He then wrapped the remains in blankets, the fabric soft and unassuming against the gravity of his task. The drive into the San Bernardino Mountains was long and winding, the car's heater blowing a steady stream of dry air against his face as he climbed higher into the cold. The road, known to locals as the Rim of the World, carved a path through the darkness, flanked by towering pines that seemed to lean in, watching the lone vehicle pass. He chose a spot where the shadows were deepest, a steep ravine where the wind whistled through the jagged rocks and the earth was frozen hard. He watched as the bundle disappeared into the darkness of the mountain slope, a silent offering to the wilderness. He kept the head and the hands, perhaps intending to dispose of them elsewhere, or perhaps unable to let go of the final pieces of the puzzle. When the torso was discovered by a group of hikers days later, the news sent a chill through the coastal basin. The remains were anonymous, a human shape stripped of its history, resting in the cold, thin air far above the world of men. Investigators were faced with a mystery that seemed as impenetrable as the mountain granite. They searched the slopes and the scrub brush, their boots crunching on the frost. But the missing pieces of Dorothy Eggers were nowhere to be found. Arthur's behavior in the wake of the discovery was described by many as wacky and inexplicably detached. He did not flee. Instead, he remained in the periphery of the investigation, offering inconsistent stories and displaying a strange, nervous energy. He even attempted to sell the very car he had used to transport the remains to the police department, a move so brazen it bordered on the surreal. During his trial, he sat with a vacant expression, his eyes often wandering to the windows as if he were listening to a sound only he could hear. The courtroom was a place of heavy wood and hushed whispers, where the details of the dismemberment were presented with a clinical somberness that contrasted with Arthur's erratic demeanor. He was a man who had tried to cut his way out of a problem, only to find that the mountains do not easily swallow the secrets of the heart. The jury saw not a man gripped by a moment of passion, but a man who had calculated the erasure of a human being. The verdict of death was delivered in a room that felt suddenly too small for the weight of the crime. Arthur Eggers was executed in the gas chamber at San Quentin in 1951, taking the location of Dorothy's head to his own grave. To this day, that piece of the story remains lost somewhere in the vast, rugged expanse of the San Bernardino Range. The mountains hold their secrets in the cold, thin air, and the wind that blows through the canyons carries only the faint, distant echo of a time when the silence was broken. As the snow falls on those peaks today, it covers the earth in a clean, white sheet, providing a quiet sort of closure to a tragedy that the world has largely forgotten. Leaving the jagged shadows of the California peaks behind, we turn our gaze northward, toward the evergreen forests and the damp, gray mists of the Pacific Northwest. In Spokane, Washington, the winter of 1944 was marked by the steady rhythm of rain against the glass and the distant, muffled sounds of a city supporting a global war effort. The air here smells of coal smoke and wet pavement, a sharp contrast to the cedar-scented heights of the San Bernardino Range. On Sprague Avenue, near a sign shop that stood as a testament to the mundane industry of the era, a small shack sat in the darkness, waiting for the morning light to reveal a scene that would haunt the community for generations. The transition from the high mountains to the urban sprawl of Spokane is a journey from the isolation of the wilderness to the crowded, often volatile proximity of a city at night. Here, in the early hours of January 15th, a different kind of silence was about to be shattered, and the restoration of truth would require a long, arduous journey through the halls of justice. The Dillon sign shop was a place of work. It sat on Sprague Avenue. Inside the small shack at the rear, the scent of paint and turpentine usually hung in the air. On this particular January morning, that familiar smell was replaced by the metallic tang of iron and the heavy, stagnant chill of a room where life had been abruptly extinguished. The party had begun hours earlier as a spontaneous gathering of strangers and acquaintances. T.P. Dillon was the host. He was a man who, perhaps fueled by the libations of the evening, had invited a crowd from a local tavern back to his modest quarters to keep the darkness of the wartime winter at bay. Among those who accepted the invitation was Jane Staples, a woman whose husband would soon become the focal point of a frantic and desperate police investigation. The shack was small, a cramped container for the laughter and conversation that flowed until the clock neared the 4 o'clock hour, when the circle of light finally began to dim. A party is a circle of light that eventually fades into the gray of morning. As the guests filtered out into the Spokane cold, only a few remained behind to sleep off the effects of the night. Among them were the Dillons, Jane Staples, Frank Winnett, and Woodrow Wilson Clark, the man they called Whitey. The transition from a celebration to a crime scene is often marked by a silence so profound it feels heavy. When the police arrived later that day, they found a scene that defied the festive origins of the evening. A hatchet, a common tool found in many workshops of the era, had been used with a rhythmic, devastating precision. T.P. Dillon and Jane Staples were beyond help. Flora Dillon would cling to life for only a few days more, leaving Frank Winnett as the sole survivor of the physical assault. Though his mind had retreated into a protective fog, erasing the memories of the struggle entirely. The investigation initially turned toward Charles Staples. He was the husband of Jane, and in the eyes of the law, he was a man of interest. The prosecutor, Leslie Carroll, viewed him with a clinical coldness, noting the presence of blood on his shoes and his known political leanings as a communist. In the tense atmosphere of 1944, such details were enough to cast a long shadow of guilt. Yet, as the evidence was gathered, the focus shifted toward Whitey Clark. He was a man who had stayed when he should have left. The prosecution built a case not on a single smoking gun, but on a collection of small, unsettling details. They spoke of a white shirt found at the scene, stained and discarded. They spoke of 2 newsboys who, while making their early morning rounds, encountered a man whose appearance was disheveled and whose clothing bore the marks of a violent encounter. Whitey's defense was built on a foundation of simple denials. He claimed that everyone was peacefully asleep when he departed at 9:30 in the morning. He suggested that the tragedy must have unfolded in the hours after his exit. His roommate testified that the blood found on a pair of trousers was the result of a mundane nosebleed from days prior. But the jury was looking for more than just facts. They were looking for a reflection of the man himself. They observed the way Whitey Clark moved in his chair. They noticed his eyes as they wandered toward the women in the gallery, to the 12 people tasked with deciding his fate. These small, seemingly meaningless actions suggested a hidden volatility. They saw a man who had been thwarted in his advances and had responded with a hatchet. They found him guilty, not because the evidence was overwhelming, but because his demeanor failed to provide the comfort of innocence. As the verdict was read, the weight of the night at the sign shop finally settled, leaving only the long, slow process of the law to follow. The transition from the courtroom to the stone walls of the Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla was a journey into a specific kind of silence. Time began to stretch. Whitey Clark was moved to the death cell on the afternoon of October 4th, 1945. Inside that small enclosure, the world was reduced to the sound of his own breathing and the steady, rhythmic ticking of a clock that seemed to grow louder with every passing minute. A chaplain sat near him, offering words that were meant to bridge the gap between this world and the next. The hours moved like heavy water. Outside the prison walls, however, the city of Spokane was far from silent, as hundreds of people took up pens and ink to voice their discomfort with the verdict. They wrote on kitchen tables and in quiet offices, their letters forming a paper trail of doubt that wound its way toward the governor's desk. These petitions spoke of the danger of circumstantial evidence and the haunting possibility that the hatchet had been wielded by hands other than those belonging to the man in the cell. The law often feels like an immovable mountain, but on that evening, the mountain shifted. At 9 o'clock, just 7 hours before the scheduled execution, the telephone in the warden's office rang. It was Lieutenant Governor Victor A. Myers. He had been reviewing the record and listening to the rising tide of public concern. He spoke of a deluge of petitions, a mountain of paper that could not be ignored. A 90-day stay of execution was granted. For Whitey, the news was not a release, but a pause. He was moved back from the edge of the abyss, granted 3 more months of borrowed time while the winter air turned sharp and gray over the prison yard. During those 90 days, the case of Whitey Clark became a matter of public conscience. A citizens' committee was formed in Spokane, led by a man named L. Lore Wartes. They met in rooms that smelled of old wood and tobacco smoke, discussing the inconsistencies of the trial and the lack of physical evidence. They argued that a man should not be sent to the gallows based on the way his eyes moved in a courtroom or the way he sat in a chair. Governor Monrad Walgren appointed a special investigator to peel back the layers of the night at the Sprague Avenue sign shop. Hope is a flickering candle in a very long hallway. For a brief window of time, it seemed that the candle might catch, that the light might grow strong enough to reveal a different truth. But as the investigation concluded, the findings did not provide the absolute clarity needed to overturn the jury's decision. The machinery of justice, once paused, began to turn again with a slow and heavy grinding. The final date was set for February 4th, 1946. The winter had settled deep into the earth by then. Whitey spent his last afternoon in a state of quiet resignation. He was fed a meal of his choice, a final indulgence in the flavors of a world he was about to leave. There were no more phone calls. No more petitions arrived to stay the hand of the state. At 11:30 that night, the warden entered the cell to read the death warrant. The words were formal and cold, a legal script that stripped away the last of his identity and replaced it with a set of instructions. At 5 minutes past midnight, the procession began. The walk to the gallows is a short one, but it is a journey that feels as though it covers miles. Whitey mounted the wooden steps, his footsteps echoing in the hollow space of the execution chamber. His arms were strapped to his sides with leather that felt cool against his skin. His legs were bound together. An individual, kept on a retainer by the state for this specific purpose, stepped forward. This expert adjusted the noose, ensuring the knot was placed with a precision that promised a quick and painless end. In an adjacent room, hidden from view, 3 volunteers stood before 3 buttons. They were strangers to the man on the trap door, participants in a ritual of shared responsibility. At the signal, the buttons were pressed simultaneously. Only one of them carried the electrical impulse that would spring the trap. The sound of the mechanism was a sharp, mechanical punctuation mark at the end of a long and complicated sentence. Whitey Clark dropped into the shadows. For 15 minutes, the room remained still, the only sound being the soft murmur of the physician and the coroner as they waited to perform their final duty. When they finally pronounced him dead, the weight of the Sprague Avenue tragedy seemed to shift once more, leaving behind a lingering question that the law could never fully answer. The gallows were cleared. The letters of petition were filed away in dusty archives, and the night returned to its natural, undisturbed quiet.